So, I guess that we are, at least in this room, ready to introduce Anna ILSØE. Anna is an associate professor at the University of Copenhagen at FAOS, which is the Employment Relations Studies Center. Is that correctly pronounced? Employment Relations Research Center, sorry about that. And Anna is going to give us a talk about her work on this subject now. So please, as with the other speakers, start by giving her a hand so we have some energy in the room. All right, the floor is yours, Anna.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to speak today as a Danish academic amongst a lot of politicians and union representatives. I'm going to talk about perhaps some of the contradictions or challenges in facing emerging gray zones. Can you hear what I say? Yeah. In the Nordic models, when we have these primarily voluntarist models of labor market regulation, meaning that we need member-based organizations to negotiate our labor market regulation, meaning we need members in our unions and employers associations. And increasingly we see emerging gray zones between standard jobs, traditional full-time permanent contract jobs, and self-employment. And as you know, it's the standard jobs that are regulated via collective agreements. So what do we do about these gray zones? Can the Nordic models face these gray zones and handle these gray zones? So that is the big question that occupies me in my research. And I'm going to present some of my very new results of my research, and I'm also going to give you perhaps my early judgment on what's going on with the social partner responses in the Nordics to this development, and perhaps some of the avenues for further development of that regulation. So what we are facing, I like to call it the evolutionary movement from a job economy to a gig economy. There are so many concepts in play, and I really like this perhaps more structural change, because some of the concepts we have are quite normative and can perhaps stop the dialogue across the bargaining table. So when I talk about this, I talk about this evolutionary change from a primarily job economy to perhaps more and more also a gig economy. So why are we discussing that, especially now and perhaps intensively within the last 2 years? It's because digitalization accelerates the development, and all the other speakers have addressed that in various ways. And I look at two main trends in my work: the automation of jobs that perhaps will lead to a further loss in permanent full-time employment, what we call traditional jobs, and the emergence of new forms of employment on digital platforms, gigs instead of jobs. How will this affect our labor market and our regulation of our labor market? This is increasingly the question because digitalization is accelerating this. So we have several open questions. I will only address one of them today, but I'm just going to give you what I'm working on. Can gigs via digital platforms replace the loss of standard jobs caused by automation? I think that's one of the open questions. If we need to work part-time standard jobs in the future, can we top off? Will there be enough gigs to top off our employment? Second question, can the voluntaristic Nordic models of labor market regulation adjust to the gig economy? This agreement-based regulation, can it adjust to this new job structure on our labor market? And if not, and I think that's very important, if not, who will do it? Because when you talk to platforms like I do and platform workers, there are risks involved in what they do, and they need risk minimizing, both of them. And if the traditional social partners do not deliver that, they look into private actors to help them. And we already see examples of that. Third open question, What are the unintended consequences of the gig economy in the long run for the Nordic welfare states? As I will demonstrate in a moment, if you look at the scope and depth on, for instance, digital platform, it's still relatively limited. But if we have a long-term perspective, what will it mean, for instance, in the case of pension savings and so on? You can still have long-term effects, even though we don't have dramatic effects as of now. Yeah. The last 2 years, I've been conducting a research project for the Danish Chamber of Commerce and the National Union of Commercial and Clerical Employees in Denmark, plus some funding from FAOS. So it's kind of a co-op project across social partners and research. And I've done 2 sub-projects. I've done more than that, but I'm only going to present to you some of the results from 2 of the sub-projects today. One is an investigation I've done on social partner responses to digitalization in 3 countries, Denmark, Sweden, and Germany, which is an interview study. And the second sub-project is a thing we did this year, is that we brought in some additional questions to the labor force survey via Statistics Denmark on the size of digital labor markets in Denmark. And we had responses from 18,000 Danes, so it's a quite large survey. And I'm going to give you some of the results of this survey, and then I'm going to add on to that, what can we do about it afterwards? So how many Danes are affected by digital automation, and what does it mean? We've heard today by the speakers that automation can lead to job destruction, but also to job change. We have had the latter perspective. What does this mean in terms of job change? So if you ask Danes how many use computers in their work or devices, 82% say we do use computers. So that's not, an information in itself. It's just, almost everybody does that. But we've also asked a number of other questions on automation. We asked about big data, how much you use computers, and so on. And we created a score of what we call office automation. That's automation for everybody who works on a computer or a device. And half of the working Danes can be categorized in the category of office automation. But more importantly, if you look into certain sectors, like knowledge-based service industries in the private sector, sectors like information and communication and finance and insurance, they score really high here. It's more than 80% that can be categorized as office automation. So this is just to demonstrate it's not just unskilled and skilled work, but it's also high-skilled work that experience a lot of transformation in their jobs due to automation. 1 in 5 working Danes use computerized machines. It's even more in farming and industry, where it's most predominant. And as I said before, there's a kind of, there's more change in those jobs who are characterized by office or machine automation. More than half of workers who have this report they have had new tasks within the last year of their work. So they have a lot of change in their job. And these groups can be in special need of further training and education. So it's not just the unskilled and the skilled, it's also some of the high-skilled that needs further training. So how many Danes earn part of their income via digital platforms, and who are they? As I said earlier, it's still a relatively limited phenomenon. 1% of Danes earned money via labor platform, such as Upwork, or the Danish platform on private cleaning, Happy Helper, during the last year. 1.5% earned money via a capital platform, such as Airbnb or GoMore, where you can rent out your car. So that's the platforms where you rent out your possessions. The majority of those who obtained an income via digital platforms earned less than 3,300 euro. So it's still relatively also limited if you look at the income over 1 year. And we conclude that until now, these earnings are primarily a supplement to another main source of income. And here I think we're very much in line with what has been found in other international investigations. So you're still dependent on your salary, your student allowance, your pension, and so on. Interestingly, perhaps surprising to us, very few Danes have earned money via both types of platforms. It seems to be very different groups that earn money via capital platforms and labor platforms, and I'm going to give you a few details on that. Labor platforms. What are the profile of people who earn money on labor platforms? The three largest groups are the employed, the students, and the unemployed. We also find an overrepresentation of young, those with low earnings, unskilled, migrants, temporary workers. So in some of these groups that are entering our labor market or find it difficult to enter our labor market. So in our report, we discuss whether there are some possibilities here, because there are groups that find it very difficult to enter the Danish labor market. Is there a possibility for labor market integration? And of course, obviously you need further investigation to see if this has a long-term effect. Will it bring people into full employment or not? I think that's the crucial question. But we also have some challenges. The volume, what they earn, is still relatively little. And that creates some problems. For instance, to be entitled to some of our public welfare services in Denmark, like social assistance and so on, as an independent worker, you should earn quite a lot to be entitled when you are unemployed. And these people do not earn a lot, so they're actually not entitled. So the interaction with our welfare system is still a challenge. Taxation is also, somebody else has mentioned that too. The capital platforms, who are they? Who earn money on them? The employed, the students, the retirees. And we see an overrepresentation of the high-skilled and those with high earnings. And we interpreted that in that way, that you need to be established on the labor market, perhaps have your own home and your own car to rent out things. So maybe it's quite logical. So what are the possibilities here? Well, the established groups on the labor market can easily obtain a supplementary income. Perhaps they can even choose a part-time job because they have a supplementary income from renting out their apartment. On the challenge side, we still haven't solved the taxation issue, and perhaps also this could change labor market behavior. I think even though capital platforms are not part of the labor market, it can affect how people behave on the labor market. So what has been the responses to all this, just to take the Danish case? Denmark, I must say, was a latecomer on tripartite initiatives to digitalization. If you look at Germany and Sweden, they had more than 8 commissions on digitalization before 2016 with broad tripartite participation, and we hadn't had one in Denmark. So we were late. But in 2017, there was a kind of catch-up effect. A lot of things happened on the tripartite arena. As earlier mentioned, there was established the Disruption Council, which runs this year and next year, with over 30 participants across social partners and industries in Denmark, discussing all aspects of digitalization. Of course, that's important, but I think maybe even more important it is to mention that this year we had 2 new tripartite agreements that are of relevance to digitalization. And one of them, I think, is quite innovative. This summer, we had a new tripartite agreement on unemployment benefits, and it's going to be implemented next summer. The content of this agreement is that in the future, all citizens in Denmark can report their income to the unemployment benefit funds, how they like. They can choose, do I prefer this is reported as independent or self-employed income, or do I prefer as a wage earner income? They can decide. And all types of income can count when it's calculated if you are entitled to unemployment benefits. So this whole discussion whether we need a third worker category or not is, with regards to this agreement, obsolete. because you can do what you want as a citizen and all your income can count. I think that's quite new and innovative, and perhaps it can be a trendsetter for further reforms of public welfare to deal with these interaction problems. The other tripartite agreement I want to mention was finished just a few weeks ago, and it's a new tripartite agreement on further training, and digitalization has been part of the negotiations as a core topic. And it's an agreement that especially addresses unskilled and skilled workers and the future further training for those workers. So in 2017, a lot of things happened on the tripartite arena. As you can see here on the bipartite arena, very little has happened. There's been some informal contacts, no collective agreements, and I don't think that is a coincidence. It's very difficult to negotiate any agreements for independent workers due to the competition laws. I think we all know that. So I think it's no coincidence that it's quite quiet on that arena. However, on the unilateral arena, meaning where single organizations take initiatives, we have had some interesting developments. Several unions in Denmark has created a pension scheme with some large pension companies. The largest one in Denmark, PFA, has created a pension scheme with 15 unions for union members who are not covered by collective agreement, meaning also independent workers. This means you can stay in the pension fund even though you become self-employed. PKA, which is also a large pension fund in Denmark for public sector employees, has created a similar scheme. 9 unions have joined that. And even in the public sector, they increasingly experience that public sector employees leave wage earner employment, create their own company, move back to public sector employment, and have a much more patchwork career, if you can say so. I think this is highly interesting because this is perhaps a driver of organization of self-employed and independent workers. They have a motivation to stay in the union even when they become self-employed. So I think this is a very interesting initiative. Yeah. So one of the questions I'm addressing my research, just to finish off, is if more citizens in the Nordic will combine different sources of income in the future, perhaps a traditional part-time job, perhaps adding on some gigs or some online renting. And most of the systems we have in place right now, they only address the part-time job, our pension savings, our taxation. So we need to address what can be done in the upper parts of this triangle. And I suggest that perhaps we should allow a shift in the balance in the Nordic models to address these upper parts of the triangle. Because what we can see, at least from the Danish case, is that we have some adjustments at the tripartite level and at the unilateral level, but the bipartite adjustments, the collective agreements, which used to be the core of our Nordic models, are more or less absent for good reasons. And perhaps we need to create adjustments first on the unilateral and the tripartite arenas to prepare the grounds for bipartite agreements in the future. Because if independent workers are not organized, it's very difficult to develop any bipartite solutions in the future. And actually, there is an example for inspiration. There's a judgment at EU level called the Albany judgment, which allows a pension agreement for independent workers. And I think that's not by coincidence. I think pensions is a core area when we address these gray zones, because everybody needs pensions and it's a lot of money. And we used to have this Ghent effect in the Nordics, that because the unemployment benefit systems and the unions were closely tied, it was keeping up our union densities. Perhaps pension schemes can have a similar effect. So we can have a future Ghent effect by creating reasonable, sound pension schemes, also for those workers who are working in the gray zones. I think we have some interesting examples of that. We also have some company level adjustments, but I think we are pretty much out of time. So I'll just say, if you want more information, we both have reports in Danish and English, and you can visit our website, faos.dk. And also in 2018, we will publish a country report in an EU project where we compare 7 EU countries on the responses to digitalization. So that's also for future reading. So thank you very much for your attention.
Bravo. Thank you so much, Anna. That was wonderful and very interesting with some concrete knowledge on what is actually going on the ground. So I think now we should have some questions, not too many, but just like a few before we give Torsten the floor and let him have his presentation, and then I think we will end by having like a longer session with both of the speakers where we can have like a dialogue with you guys, but also perhaps between the speakers on how to move forward with this subject. But I can see that Jon Erik from FAFO already is ready to ask a question. And I'll run down here with the mic. Yes, I need some exercise.
Yes, the Danes need to be mobile today, especially those in Ireland. When listening to this, I'm so happy that you're part of this Nordic project, Anna.
Yeah.
But my question is, this agreement on further training, do you envisage that it could be linked to similar constructions as the pension schemes and the Danish, let's say, bilateral pension agreements built around funds? Because when I think what we see is that lifelong learning and continuous retraining is becoming crucial, more and more crucial, and that the public schemes are not able to turn around and respond to this flexibility. So there is a scope, at least, for some new social constructions to offer these things. And in my view, if pension and lifelong learning or further training could be linked, you really have strong incentives for everyone to join. What's your comment? That's the question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Perhaps we should just have one more question before we let Anna answer that quite comprehensive question. Anyone? Good? Here? And please introduce yourself, who you are and where you're from.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Hedvig Forselius with the Unionen, called Unionen in English, I don't know why, trade union in Sweden. I was curious to ask you whether you see any gender differences in your statistics on the number of people working in the gig economy and on the platforms. You told us a bit about younger people and older, but could you see any clear gender differences or not?
Thank you very much. I think if there is one last question, we will take that and let Anna answer, and then we will move on. Jonas, from the Swedish LO. No, sorry, Norwegian.
Yeah, my name is Jonas Lovdahl from Norwegian LO. I was wondering, I think you said that the new agreement makes it possible that you can take your salary and report it as regular income or not, and that will be able to affect your possibilities to get unemployment benefits. Yes. So, how expensive is it? Will workers that are paid very little per hour be able to afford it, or is it a general system that it's affordable for everyone and it's actually something that's going to change something?
Okay, please go ahead, Anna.
Okay, so first question on further training. Can we create schemes similar to the pension schemes for union members not covered by collective agreements? So there has been debates in Denmark on individual training accounts or the like, but there hasn't really been agreement on that among the social partners, is my impression. I think what you're hinting at, and I think might be the more likely avenue, is that the pension companies should be the driver of this. I think the pension companies could be a driver of many things when it comes to the grey zones and independent workers and what's going to happen, because you, at least you don't know you want it, but when you get old you would like to have done it. You would like to have paid pension your whole working life. So this is a constant in your working life. No matter if you combine self-employment and wage earner employment, or you switch between the two stages. So this is a kind of constant throughout your working life. So I think, and the problem with the education account is that you have high mobility, at least on the Danish labor market, so it's very difficult to tie to one workplace, and so if you tie it to the pension, maybe it's more easy. So the question is, of course, will this be in cooperation with unions? I think this pension scheme I just demonstrated, that's in cooperation with unions, so that can also be a driver of organization, of creating union members. So perhaps that could also be interesting for unions to reflect upon, whether or not you could create schemes with the pension companies, both on pension and training. Yeah. So then there was the question on the gender composition on those who earn money on platforms. Actually, there's not so much difference. There are both men and women. That's also why I didn't bring that figure here, because there are not so many gender differences, at least for Denmark. I know in some other countries they have a predominance of men, but in Denmark there's kind of an equal distribution of women and men who earn money via platforms. Then there was the question on the unemployment benefits. I must admit I'm not sure if what the exact calculations will be in limits, and I'm not sure if anybody knows that yet, because it's not finally approved, this agreement. But my understanding is that they won't change the limit on how much you should earn to be entitled to unemployment benefits. The new thing is you can blend your income sources, and you can use all your income sources to earn your benefits. So the main problem has been hitherto that either you should have a high income as self-employed or as wage earner to be entitled. So if you had little in both, that was difficult. Now you can combine. That's the new thing.
Can you combine Airbnb income as well?
I'm not sure that, because that's not income from employment. That's capital income. At least in Denmark it's considered capital income. It's not from employment.
But with that being said,
yeah,
give Anna a hand.
Hi.
All right, and our next speaker, Torsten Müller, who is a senior researcher at ETUI, the European Trade Union Institute. And Jose will help us with the slides. And Torsten has a lot of experience studying industrial relations, so he will give us an insight in how collective bargaining and these new developments will play together. So please prepare for Torsten.
I click here, that's the first challenge. Okay, yeah, thank you very much. You can hear me, huh? That works. Thank you very much for inviting me, for giving me the opportunity to address you here, and in particular also to witness Sweden's qualification for the World Cup yesterday. This will be one of those moments when Sweden wins the World Cup next year. I can say, I was there when they qualified. So one of these momentous situations. So, to more profane issues like digitalization and collective bargaining. What I will do is I will put it into perspective first, the whole phenomenon of digitalization, and contrast it with the state of collective bargaining across Europe in a broad way. I will identify a few challenges resulting from digitalization, and then I will talk you through some of the developments or some of the aspects of the debate in Germany and how they try to cope with these challenges there. Now, the first thing is, when we talk about the challenges of digitalization, we have to be aware that the challenges of digitalization come on top of many other challenges resulting from certain megatrends. And I named 4 here. The first megatrend, which has an impact on collective bargaining and trade union strength, is the structural change. We see the undermining of certain former union strongholds by shifting from manufacturing to services and privatization in the public sector. Closely related to that, an increase of precarious and atypical forms of employment. These kind of categories of workers are also difficult to organize. Then the whole notion of globalization. I think one of the key aspects here is it enables companies to do some kind of regime shopping, putting pressure on unions and on working conditions and wages. And then we have this rather loose notion of a neoliberal hegemony, which was reinforced by the crisis, and we saw that in particular in the southern European countries when the Troika moved in and enforced reforms which basically dismantled collective bargaining in some of the countries. And this kind of spirit, I mean, the Nordic or northern European countries have not been that heavily affected by these kind of reform policies enforced by the Troika, but the spirit is still there, and we have to be careful and not to feel too safe. Now, so that is one thing, and that obviously had effects. These are just some figures on trade union density from 2000 to 2013. I don't want to go into too much detail, but what we can see is that the light blue bar for 2001 is always considerably higher than the very light blue bar on the right-hand side. So we saw a decrease across Europe in trade union density. We can also see that obviously the countries fare differently. The Nordic countries, Finland, Sweden, Denmark in particular, still fare fairly well compared to other countries, but even there we see a slight decrease in trade union density. Obviously the same applies to collective bargaining coverage. There we also see that in particular those countries with still strong trade unions, like in the Nordic countries, or those countries like Austria and Belgium where we have functional equivalents, institutional functional equivalents that ensure high collective bargaining coverage, they show a fairly stable development. But in all the other countries, we see considerable drops sometimes in collective bargaining coverage, and in particular, once again, in those countries that have been heavily affected by the crisis and the Troika reform policies. So why do I show this? I just want to show this because the challenges of digitalization hit trade unions and hit collective bargaining systems in a very difficult situation, in a very difficult stage. And then we have to keep in mind the very nature of digitalization. The very nature of digitalization is not to improve working conditions, wages, and the situation of workers. It's business driven. The main driver is a rationale of rationalization of production and to reduce costs. And we always have to try, as unionists, we always have to try to bring in the social dimension to this whole process. And that's what I want to emphasize throughout my presentation. The impact of digitalization very much depends on the power relations at workplace and at political level, and that's why unionization, high union density, and strong collective bargaining systems are so essential when dealing with these kind of challenges. And that's the second point I want to refer to. It's also efficient regulation, and by that I mean legal regulation. In some countries, Germany, legal situations plays a stronger role. In other countries, it's collective bargaining and collective agreements, and that would apply more to the Nordic situation, that ensures workers' rights. Now, what are the new challenges resulting from digitalization? And I think we can break it down in terms of content. Obviously, new issues emerge. And there we see a blurring of the situation of work time and of spare time, which creates a difficult situation, which can create stress situations or increased stress or the perceived stress if you are constantly available. And that is related to the second point. There are health issues, obviously related to a potential for work intensification. Then there are skills and qualification issues. We've heard this morning already that there is a need for skills adaptation, upgrading, retraining, further training. But I think a very important issue here is also access to training. I mean, we have to ensure that all the workers have access to training, that there are equal opportunities for all the workers. That's another important issue, and that needs to be regulated by some kind of law or collective agreement. And then obviously there's the issue of workers' rights. And that also has many sides. One obviously is data protection. I mean, with this new kind of technologies, there is an endless potential to survey workers. I mean, at Amazon, when they work in these big halls, I think every movement can be surveyed by the employer, how they move, how they get the different things on the conveyor belt. And obviously, there is an obvious need for data protection for workers from 100% surveillance, but workers' rights also applies to the right of workers to be involved in the process in actually implementing these whole new technologies, and that applies to trade unions at a collective level, but also to workers at the individual level at the workplace. We have to ensure that this involvement is guaranteed. So that's the content. We see new developments there, but then we also see kind of a process dimension, and that relates to the coverage of collective agreements, where we see challenges because there's a new category of workers emerging, the freelancers or crowd workers, and it's I mean, Anna's presentation, I think, showed it very clearly that there is a very unclear status, employment status of these kind of workers. Are these employees? Is this self-employment? Is this bogus self-employment? And what are the rights related of these workers to their status, to their employment status? Because as freelancers or self-employed workers, they don't have access. I mean, first of all, their wages are way below the minimum average. Secondly, they don't have rights in terms of access to social security systems. They don't get holiday pay, they don't get Christmas bonuses and all that. So that rights are linked to an employment status. So that's an important question that needs to be clarified. And that's related to the coverage of collective agreements. I mean, one of the aims should be that these kind of workers are also covered by collective agreements. Now, I come to Germany now, and what's the debate there? Anna mentioned already that there were plenty of committees and working groups and stuff. I mean, that's the natural reaction in Germany. If you don't know what to do, you first establish a working group and a forum for discussion, and there were plenty of them indeed. It's very interesting when we talk about government initiatives. There have been plenty of initiatives by the government or the economics ministry in order to support startups and create a business-friendly environment in terms of digitalization, in particular for small and medium-sized enterprises, which are the backbone of the German economy. But the social dimension didn't fare very prominently in all those initiatives, and that was taken care of to some extent by the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, which were run by a social democratic labor minister at the time, at least. And there were basically three broader activities that have been taken. One, and that was not directly related to digitalization, one was there was an awareness that we have a problem in Germany with collective bargaining coverage. So there was a law strengthening the collective bargaining autonomy, which had two key elements. One was the introduction of a statutory minimum wage, and the second one was some kind of less restrictive criteria for the extension of collective agreement. That, as I said, was not directly related to digitalization, but it can help in dealing with digitalization. The second one was, there were some considerations about changes of the Working Time Act to make working time more flexible or to enable companies to regulate or to kind of implement more flexible working time as arrangements. And that was, there's a trial period to see how this kind of need of companies for more flexibility can be linked with the workers' need for protection from this kind of flexible arrangements, and how to strike a balance there. It's a trial period. It's not over yet, so we will see on the basis of this trial period, new initiatives will then be taken. But now we will have a new government soon without social democratic participation. So the ball is up in the air again. We don't know what happens then. The Liberals might be part of that coalition, and I'm quite pessimistic what happens then. But, and that's what Anna referred to, then there was a broad social dialogue on the future of work, and that had also two elements. One was a dialogue on Industry 4.0, and one was a dialogue on Work 4.0. And the dialogue on Industry 4.0 was more on the one business-friendly environment and stuff, and the dialogue on Work 4.0 was the one that actually dealt with how can we deal with the social consequences of digitalization. So there were several working groups, I think 8, 9 different working groups within this kind of forum on social dialogue. And it was always, the key objective was obviously to involve unions and employers, but also civil society. Now, that was all based on a green book. The Ministry of Labor once put a green book together, raising some issues, raising some challenges and questions. And when you have a green book with questions, we all know then you have a white paper at some stage, providing some answers and suggestions. And that was published in November 2016. We are still in the process of recommendations, so no concrete measures have been taken yet in terms of laws or anything. It was basically to collect information, because I think, and that's why Anna's research is so important, we need empirical knowledge about what's out there, what's happening actually, because very much we are still at the stage of informed guessing to a certain extent, what's going on out there. And that's why this exercise was actually quite useful with this white paper, because it was also a collection of best practice examples. And if you go on the Ministry of Labor website, then you can also download this white paper. It's quite interesting reading, actually. But the key point was to collect recommendations and best practice examples that then inform further measures. And in that stage we are at the moment. Now, how important it is to actually create this kind of consensus shows the following 2 slides will show that. That's the position of the employers. And that was a position paper to the Green Book, which was published in 2015. And the employers were quite clear, we don't want any further regulation, in particular with respect to non-permanent contracts and agency work. They wanted this flexibility. They wanted more working time flexibility, in particular with respect to the length per day and per week. They wanted a limitation to co-determination. As you all know, in Germany we have quite far-reaching co-determination rights of works councils at company level. And they said that slows down decision-making processes. The digital work moves quickly, and if we have co-determination and works councillors asking questions, they slow down the process. We need limitations in that area. And then, of course, they don't want an extension of employee rights to freelancers, and that's exactly what I mentioned before. We have to clarify the status, the employment status of this kind of category of workers, because at the moment, well, some people say they are the new digital proletariat without much rights. So, and the employers want to use that, obviously. Now, the unions, well, obviously they have quite different views. With respect to working time, they say we need to strike a balance between the flexibility needs of the companies and the need of the employees to be protected from this kind of crazy drive to be accessible and available all the time. Second is, they wanted more working time sovereignty for the employees, meaning that the employees should have more right to determine their when and how they work. The third point is workers' rights for further training. I mentioned that already, very important. The fourth point, and that's diametrically opposed to the employer's position, obviously, it's the strengthening of co-determination rights, and that's in particular with respect to the use of these very highly flexible forms of employment, like agency work, that should be subcontracting and not COP contracting. I don't know. Maybe I watch too much of these COP conferences in Paris and Bonn or whatever. And crowd working. I think that was very important for the German trade unions. that works councillors and unions have a say in how the company uses this kind and these different forms of employment. Now, to conclude, what role for collective bargaining? I think collective bargaining can still have a role, or should have a role even. But it's related to certain preconditions. And the first one is we need to mobilize political support for collective bargaining, and that through stricter regulation. And by stricter regulations, I don't mean laws, I also mean collective agreements, which on the one hand clearly specifies the rights of workers, but which also takes into consideration this kind of flexibility needs of companies. We have to find a balance of that. But we need to clearly define rights of workers, because at the moment, to a certain extent, we are in a kind of lawless room there. There's a vacuum which needs to be filled. And the second thing is we need more widespread use of extension. That applies to the German context. In the Nordic context, extension mechanisms, I mean, you have a strong union density which works as an equivalent. As long as this is still the case, there is no need for legal extensions, but you might come to a stage, in particular in terms of the megatrends I've identified before, where union density and collective bargaining coverage come down. I mean, we had the same experience in Germany. We wouldn't have the legal minimum, the statutory minimum wage, if we hadn't reached a point in terms of collective bargaining coverage, which was so low that we say certain segments of the labor market cannot be covered and cannot be guaranteed with a minimum wage. So we need legal support, just as a look into the future. That does not apply to the Nordic situation at the moment, but who knows. Now, and that's as regards content, I think unions need to address these issues, because one of the key points here is they need to be relevant for these kind of workers. And these workers need to recognize the union can actually do something for me. And then, that's the third point linked to that, because then we can extend collective bargaining coverage to these new kind of employees. And that is my final slide, and that shows something is going on. I mean, right now in the other room, Sig Silberman is talking about this Fair Crowd Work platform. And that's one initiative which IG Metall, together with the Austrian unions, ÖGB and Unionen, actually, from Sweden. And this is basically a platform which they set up with basically three key intentions. The first one was they wanted to create a forum for these kind of platform workers where they can exchange experiences. The second one is they should exchange information about the conditions which certain platforms offer. So it creates a certain transparency about the conditions these different platforms offer. And the third point, obviously very important for unions, this is also one means to get into contact with these people, because, I mean, with this dispersed working environment, you don't go to a big factory anymore and you speak to people at the factory gate. It's very easy in that respect. Here it's much more difficult because you don't know where these people are. So this is obviously also a very good tool to get in contact with these people and to actually make them interested in unions, and to inform them, to provide advice, and to show them we can do something for you. And in the future, I think what we should aim for is we should have collective agreements for these kind of dependent or bogus self-employed people, because we need to ensure we've seen their wages. I mean, at the moment, we are still at the stage where this is supplementary income, but this might change as well, and then we need to find ways to ensure that they have a minimum remuneration, and that can be, once again, dealt with in analogy to a minimum wage, but it can also be regulated by collective agreements, obviously. And the future, of course, would be collective agreements for platforms, and that can apply to two things: to the companies that run the platforms, but also to the companies that actually use these platforms in order to get their work done. And I think there we have to think about creative solutions, how to extend collective bargainings or collective agreements to these kind of new arrangements in order to guarantee that certain rights apply to these kind of workers as well. I leave it at that, and then we can discuss further in a few seconds.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Give him a hand. Okay, so let's have two super short questions with two super short answers from Torsten before we get Anna up here, and we'll have a more broad debate. Are there anyone who wants to ask Torsten something right now? Because otherwise we'll just get Anna up here immediately, so we have some more broad time for discussion. Excellent, let's do that. Anna, please re-enter the stage. So guys, if you can stand over here.
We can.
Anna, are you still hooked up to the mic?
Yeah.
Excellent. Can you hear Anna?
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right, great. Well, Torsten, you finished up by saying creative solutions from the trade unions and collective agreements. Perhaps, Anna, what is your take on this? You've been talking with a lot of the Danish platforms, but also the trade unions. What do you think of Torsten's suggestions here?
I think obviously it could raise wage and working conditions if you do collective agreements for platforms, but I see many barriers at the moment for stepping into that. So I would like to ask Torsten, how will you create the opportunity within existing competition laws to negotiate wages for independent workers? I haven't seen any examples where that has been possible. I see mainly the potential on all the things that come on top of the wages. The Albany verdict or judgment allowed a pension agreement for independent workers. So perhaps that's the avenue to follow. I think price and wage, I think that will go much too into clinch with the competition laws. So what do you think needs to be done to make it possible to do these collective agreements?
Good question.
I wouldn't dare to say to suggest any solutions what the unions should do. They know best what they should do. But I wanted to raise awareness to one issue where I think there is a big need for clarification, and that's the employment status. Because for me, this self-employment, I don't know to what extent this is voluntary self-employment, you see. And very often we have a state of bogus self-employment there. And if these workers would have the status of employees, which de facto, because very often they only work for one company that assigns these kind of contracts or tasks, so they are de facto employees of that one company that makes use of them. And if they would qualify as employees, then we could also negotiate wages for them. So it's all hooked up with that definition of their employment status, whether they are employees or self-employed. I'm not suggesting that trade unions can negotiate wages for self-employed. There we enter really fishy territory. I mean, that's difficult. But I go one step before that. I question actually their status, whether they are self-employed or not, and there I think we need clarification. And then we can also negotiate wages for them and working conditions.
Do you have a quick comment for that, Anna?
Yes, I think we also need to look into that many of these platforms are startups. And they start up with distributing gigs for independent workers. But what we see now, in Denmark at least, some of them are maturing. And some of them are moving in the direction of having employees. I've interviewed the first platform in Denmark that became into a temporary work agency with employees. And it was an interesting story. And that's one avenue. The other avenue we see is that some of them are maturing in the direction of having full-time self-employment with higher hourly wages. And I think these are the Danish-owned platforms. I'm not talking about the US-owned. But I think we also see a maturing of some of the business models. And perhaps the dialogues with platforms is also important from the social partners in that respect. I don't know if you see any similar developments in Germany, but...
That was a rhetorical question, because now we also need to get
okay.
get the floor in here. Before you two, I'm sure you can talk all day, and that would also be interesting, but we need to give the audience a chance as well to interact with you. And I think Jon Erik has a question for you guys. And Jose is helping me getting the mic around, that's great.
On this note, of course, there are numbers of hurdles, but my question is, there are also avenues, I would guess, and you suggest there are, even for those who cannot be redefined as employees, but are somehow self-employed. I guess in all our countries, the unions for musicians, artisans, cultural workers and so on have a tradition for let's say, developing framework agreements for standard contracts, for basic standards, even for pay for having a speech or entertainment gig or whatever, which the main confederations of trade unions actually already have on board. That's one avenue, but couldn't we also have an avenue that goes for subcontracting and temporary work agency, where user companies, collective agreements with user companies, define and determine the procedures and standards and frameworks on the conditions under which you can use these kind of short-term contracts. Finally, isn't there a court decision of the European Court saying that if these guys somehow are used in an analog way as employees, they actually can strike a collective agreement? It's not forbidden per se. And we had a Norwegian white paper suggesting that they should get these rights. Of course, the employer said immediately that that would be nonsense. We're not there, but anyway. What's your comment?
Let's have a few short comments on that from, if you want to pitch in.
Yeah. Well, I agree there are examples of EU judgments that allow, but I think I can understand if organizations are hesitating to move into that territory because it's case by case and you have to do a lot of testing. But I think it's true. And it's also true about the creative industries. For instance, in Denmark, we have some agreements on journalists that could be an inspiration. And in fact, I think for this whole digitalization agenda, we should learn from the creative industries because they have been struggling with these things for many, many years. Also the graphic industry and so on. So I think that's a nice way to move forward.
Torsten, do you want to pitch in?
No, but it's interesting if you could find out which case that is, because I'm not aware of that European judgment.
I think as far as I know, there's of course the temp agency directive, which is to some extent covering this, and that's perhaps also an interesting question we could talk about. Why aren't these platforms just treated as temp agencies? And that is also interesting. I know in Denmark we have some discussions about whether or not that's a good way to try and follow that path, or whether or not it will be a dead end, because at least in Denmark the way it's implemented is that it's only if in the company there are some kind of collective agreement you have to follow that. But when we see the whole peer-to-peer economy, well, that won't necessarily help those workers. So that is interesting, and there's the written statement directive, which will come out soon. Perhaps Thibaut can enlighten us about that, but there's also some interesting stuff going on there. Okay, now guys, I can see we have the other guys coming out for lunch. So I think if we can have perhaps the last 2 or 3 questions, if you have any, we will also enlighten our other session here, and then after that we can send you to lunch. And we have a question down here.
My name is Gylfi from the ASI or LO in Iceland. I missed Iceland on the density chart. Because
Norway as well.
Yes, well, it's interesting because many of the topics that you have been discussing, the educational funds that we established 10 or 15 years ago, moving into Ghent, using other types, pension funds certainly. So we have actually been trying to do that, not because of digitalization, because that we have these small companies that we have to cover, and our members need to have their rights outside of the companies and not inside of them. So we have actually used funds to do that, to establish that. And actually, in 2011, one of our major confederations managed to get an agreement in the construction industry that solo self-employed workers are covered by the collective agreements. And through that, we can then use the extension clauses that we have by law. So I think we're on the path here of figuring out how can we do this But I see you use the verb solo self-employed, because this is always a difficulty going from self-employment to entrepreneur to employer. And it's a sort of gray zone there. Where do you stop? So you use this word. I think it's something that we have been discussing back home. Where should we put the line between the self-employed? But it's more in the frame of a comment here. Thank you.
A last few questions, anyone? Otherwise, we will close up by having you guys reflect on this and whatever thoughts you might want to share with us. What is the way forward here? So please, guys, take it away.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And where you draw the line, I think the question of whether this is freely chosen or whether this is imposed on a worker, I think that's a very important distinction. I mean, we see the same with part-time work. I mean, sometimes it's freely chosen. Sometimes it's imposed on a worker, and I think that dimension plays a very important role when drawing the line between self-employment, solo self-employment, and then on the way to the becoming an employer. I have to apologize for the data. It's EU data, and they never provide any information on Iceland or Norway. Norway is also excluded. We should register a complaint on that one. I will bring it. I will bring it home.
Okay. So my closing remark will be on the temporary work agency idea. Is that the solution to platform workers, to non-standard work? One example is that this platform in Denmark, that is the first one to have employees, they created a temporary work agency. But how are they hired? They are hired on 0-hour contracts. So it's not, you solve some problems. You solve some of the juridical problems of having a contract and not being covered by Working Environment Act and so on, but perhaps you don't solve all the problems. Maybe you create another form of non-standard work. So it's not perhaps a quick fix. Yeah.
That's a good remark. And perhaps my own comment for this is also interesting to look at the case law that's going on now in the UK with the Employment Tribunal. The second time saying, yes, Uber is still an employer. That's interesting to look at, but also in the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, there's also one on Uber, not on this question, but they are actually talking a lot about these subjects, which are interesting to look into. But all right, guys, give them a big hand. And then